In a mansion, a luxurious slave is fiercely whipping the overseer. The whip cracks loudly, each lash seeming to pierce through the flesh. Nearby, the other slaves watch in surprise, as they have never seen a slave whip an overseer. The overseer rolls on the ground in pain, but the slave seems unsatisfied. He picks up a gun from the ground without hesitation and pulls the trigger. The maid watches with wide eyes, looking at this unusual slave before her. The slave's name is Django. He was once an enslaved man under this overseer's rule. In rebellion against the violent rule, he attempted to escape with his wife twice, but each time they were caught and brought back. The overseer whipped the woman's weak back with the lash. Django pleaded for his wife, offering to accept any punishment, but the overseer only intensified his torment of the woman. Eventually, the overseer branded a symbol of humiliation on their faces and sold them to different states. One day, they encountered Schultz's wagon in the woods, the wagon shaking with his ridiculous big teeth. Schultz politely said he wanted to buy Django, but the slave owner refused the German's offer outright and raised his gun without hesitation. Ignoring Schultz's request, the slave owner prepared to pull the trigger. Schultz showed a resigned expression. Schultz freed Django and the other slaves and gave them the opportunity to seek revenge on their master. He also gave Django a horse. Schultz's real profession is a bounty hunter, and the 3 murderers he is after are Django's former overseers. So Django agreed to work with Schultz and help capture the 3 criminals. The bartender refused to serve the slaves, but Schultz immediately kicked him out, daring him to call the sheriff. The sheriff appeared, gun in hand, ready to discipline the people in front of him. But then, the situation took a 180-degree turn in the next second. Upon hearing the situation, the sheriff immediately led his men to surround the outlaw, but Schultz's attitude suddenly changed. He obediently surrendered, even pulling out an official document. The police officer lying on the ground was actually a wanted man for cattle rustling. Schultz held the bounty notice signed by the judge, which meant his actions were not only innocent but that he could also claim a bounty from the sheriff. The two left the bar, and along the way, Django was constantly being stared at, which puzzled Schultz. Django explained that no slave was allowed to ride a horse. Django told Schultz that Broomhilda grew up in a German noble's house and even spoke German. Schultz felt that fate had guided him to save Django and his wife, and perhaps it was his responsibility. The two rode to Tennessee, and Schultz prepared a new outfit for Django. They arrived at the slave owner's mansion. When Big Daddy saw the slave on horseback, he immediately became furious. Schultz explained that Django was a free man, not a slave, so he could ride. Big Daddy said that on his land, this was unacceptable, but Schultz, in the manner of a businessman, quickly convinced him that he could make money off the deal. Reluctantly, Big Daddy put on a respectful demeanor and even agreed to have a maid accompany Django to show him around. Django's purpose was, of course, not to take a walk, but to find the 3 fugitive criminals hiding there. With the maid's direction, Django recognized the familiar, hateful face. In his memory, the man had lashed Broomhilda's back, leaving it torn and bloody. No matter how much he pleaded, it was all for nothing. The other 2 accomplices were still tormenting a female worker when Django angrily charged toward them. Before the man could speak, Django shot him straight in the chest. He then grabbed the whip and rushed toward the other man. The surrounding slaves were stunned, and they couldn't help but watch, which only fueled Django's momentum. He fired several shots at the bloody man. By the time Schultz arrived, he found that 2 of the 3 targets had already been taken care of. Big Daddy came over, and Schultz quickly presented the bounty notice, proving he had legally shot the fugitives. Though the slave owner was furious, the document signed by a federal judge couldn't be ignored, so he had to swallow his anger. That night, he surrounded Schultz's wagon, preparing to settle the score. Big Daddy urged everyone to act quickly, but at that moment, Schultz shot the wagon from the shadows. It turned out that Schultz had already predicted that Big Daddy would harbor a grudge and seek revenge. He had moved the valuables in the wagon and placed them in a conspicuous spot. Moreover, in the eyes of the German who had already abolished the Hun's practices, slave owners like Big Daddy, who disregarded both law and humanity, were the kind of people Schultz despised the most. After this encounter, Django officially became Schultz's partner, and the two set off on a bounty hunting journey. One day, they arrived at a remote farm. Django aimed his gun at a target in the distance, but hesitated when he saw the fugitive had a son. Schultz handed Django the bounty notice and reminded him that this was a robbery and murder criminal, and the bounty was $7,000. Django then shot the man with perfect precision, his shooting skills rivaling any seasoned hunter. Schultz marveled at Django's talent and began to train him professionally. Django's skills grew sharper and sharper. Winter passed, and Schultz and Django descended from the mountain toward the place where Broomhilda was held. Schultz found out that Broomhilda had been sold to the fourth largest plantation in the area, but how to infiltrate it was a problem. According to Django's logic, they should just show up with guns blazing, but Schultz, unwilling to resort to illegal actions, planned to find a more convincing reason to enter. Considering the local popularity of a game called Mandingo fighting, Schultz decided to pretend to be a buyer and have Django pose as a slave trader to use the purchase of a Mandingo fighter as an excuse to sneak in for his wife. Django agreed to endure it, and the two successfully entered the arena under this identity. There, they met Calvin, the plantation owner, who looked at Django with a mixture of curiosity and intrigue as he saw his bold demeanor. Calvin was impressed but didn't show it immediately. Meanwhile, slaves were engaged in brutal, life-or-death combat, with bone-crushing sounds echoing through the arena, and the slave owners were intoxicated by the bloodshed. One of Calvin's slaves overpowered the opponent and literally twisted his arm off. Though the fight was decided, Calvin wasn't satisfied. He threw a hammer at the slave and had him finish off his opponent. Calvin then happily rewarded the slave with a bottle of beer as compensation for the brutal act. At that point, Calvin noticed the visitor with Schultz was speaking quite arrogantly. Django's attitude surprised him, and with Schultz mediating, he didn't erupt in anger, but he refused to sell his slave because an excellent Mandingo could earn him a lot of money. At this moment, Schultz offered an irresistible price of $12,000. Calvin said, "You've got my attention." The next day, Calvin invited Schultz to a gathering. A bodyguard tried to provoke Django, but Django swiftly pulled him down along with his horse and followed up with a skillful gun draw. Intimidating him, Calvin finally realized Django was no ordinary man and ordered everyone to stop bothering his guest as they gradually approached Candyland. Django grew increasingly eager to see his wife, but his commanding attitude toward the people on foot unsettled Schultz, who worried Django's behavior might offend Calvin. Django explained that he was doing this to gain their trust. Schultz fell silent, realizing Django was right sometimes. For the right cause, one had to resort to despicable methods. While Schultz could be ruthless toward criminal offenders, he struggled to be harsh toward innocent slaves. Thus, when Calvin intended to kill a runaway slave, Schultz abruptly offered $500 to buy him. Such untimely kindness easily aroused suspicion, and Calvin clearly sensed something was off. Luckily, Django quickly took over the conversation. Calvin then ordered his men to release the dogs to kill the slave. The barking and screams excited the onlookers. Schultz quietly turned his head away, but his indifference eased Calvin's doubts. The group proceeded to Candyland. The old butler came out to welcome them, but as soon as he saw Django on horseback, his eyes burned with rage. However, upon seeing his master, the butler immediately put on a servile smile. Hearing that Django was a free man and would be staying in the house as a guest, the butler almost forgot his place in anger, threatening to burn everything Django touched. Calvin scolded him, and the butler reluctantly fell silent. It was clear that although the butler was a slave, his mindset and habits had been entirely assimilated into the role of serving his master. Calvin introduced Schultz to his widowed sister, but Schultz showed no interest. Instead, Schultz requested to meet the German-speaking maid. Calvin understood and ordered Broomhilda to be brought over. The butler mentioned that Broomhilda was being punished for running away. Django nearly lost his composure upon hearing this, but Calvin canceled the punishment and ordered her release. The camera showed just how inhumane the punishment was. Django felt pain in his heart as he saw it, and his gaze toward the butler was filled with murderous intent. Shortly after, Lara brought the well-dressed Broomhilda. To avoid suspicion, Schultz conversed with Broomhilda in German. He told her that a friend had come a long way to rescue her and that she had only one task: to stay calm and not scream upon seeing him. According to their plan, Schultz would later find an excuse to purchase Broomhilda. At the dinner table, they even deliberately exchanged flirtatious glances. However, while they managed to deceive Calvin, his sharp-eyed sister Lara noticed something was off. The butler, even more astute, sensed that Broomhilda might know Django. He began testing her. Although Broomhilda tried her best to deny it, her unnatural expression betrayed her. To confirm his suspicions, the butler deliberately asked Broomhilda to show the scars on her back. Closely observing Django's reaction, seeing Broomhilda being humiliated, Django nearly drew his gun. At that moment, Lara stepped in, interrupting the spectacle. After noting Django's reactions, the butler took the opportunity to pull Calvin aside and share his conclusions. The butler deduced that Django deeply cared about Broomhilda and that the two might even be married. As for Schultz's involvement, the butler couldn't quite figure it out. Calvin couldn't understand why anyone would go to such lengths for a maid, but the butler pointed out the truth with one sharp remark.
You wouldn't pay no never mind to no $300. But that $12,000, that made you real friendly now, didn't it?
Calvin realized he had been thoroughly played. Returning to the table, he kept his anger in check but could barely contain it. He no longer engaged with Schultz. Instead, he brought out a gleaming white skull, explaining it belonged to an old slave who had served his father. The man had shaved his father's beard 3 times a week for 50 years without ever harming him. Calvin attributed this to the submissive nature of the indentations in the man's skull. This speech was meant to humiliate Django, and by the end, Calvin finally erupted. Schultz and Django didn't react in time, allowing Calvin to confiscate their weapons. Broomhilda was then brought in and humiliated in front of them. Calvin demanded Schultz pay the agreed $12,000 for her purchase. Otherwise, he threatened to dispose of her however he pleased, picking up a hammer as he spoke. At this critical moment, Schultz hesitated no longer. The butler took the money from Schultz's wallet, and to avoid future legal disputes, Calvin insisted on a signed contract. Schultz had no choice but to comply, entering into the slave trade he despised most. As Beethoven's Für Elise played in the hall, a piece beloved by Germans, Calvin's selection was an intentional act of mockery in Schultz's mind. However, the images of the runaway slave being torn apart by dogs replayed. The ignorant and hypocritical Calvin, who enjoyed being addressed in French, didn't even speak the language himself or know the authors of the books he displayed. He pretended to be cultured but was, in reality, cruel and bloodthirsty, earning universal contempt. In the end, Schultz's principles were shattered by such barbarism. He reluctantly signed the contract but refused to bid Calvin farewell, saying instead that goodbye or farewell forever would be more fitting. Once again, Calvin was provoked by Schultz's attitude, demanding a handshake before the contract could be finalized. Schultz glanced at Django, seemingly making a decision. In a near martyrdom act, Schultz paid the price for the only moment of personal indulgence in his life. Django immediately seized the gun and unleashed the deadly marksmanship he had honed all winter. One by one, the farmhands who charged and met their end. Django's shots were nearly flawless, and the fallen bodies became his human shields. Exaggerated bursts of blood and shattered bones accompanied each shot, creating a peculiar rhythm. As more enemies poured in, Django realized he was out of bullets. At this moment, the butler ordered his men to capture Broomhilda, forcing Django to surrender. For his wife's safety, Django had no choice but to comply. He removed his coat and allowed himself to be bound. He was then hung up, ready for a cruel punishment. At this moment, the butler interrupted, saying that Lara wanted Django alive to send him to the mountain mines. This wasn't an act of mercy, though, as dying from exhaustion and torture in the mines was far worse than bleeding to death. But they underestimated Django's cunning. His acting skills had been honed through practice. On the way to the mines, Django asked his guards if they wanted to make some easy, legal money. Intrigued, the men listened as Django explained that he was actually a bounty hunter. During his last mission, he accidentally injured his master and was mistaken for a slave. He even had the bounty notices Schultz had given him during their first job, listing the names of the 3 fugitives they had hunted. Other slaves could vouch for Django's status as a respected free man who had ridden into the plantation on horseback. Believing Django's story, the guards handed him a gun when he asked for it. Emerging from the smoke, Django armed himself, took the saddle off a horse, and grabbed explosives handed to him by the other slaves. With their admiring eyes upon him, Django rode off a freed knight, no longer just a cowboy in a saddle. Returning to Candyland, Django dispatched the plantation's henchmen one by one. Before reuniting with Broomhilda, he found Schultz's remains in the stable. To the man who had freed and guided him, Django finally spoke the words he had long wanted to say. For Django, the greatest form of love and kindness is to offer equal treatment and friendship. The trapped princess finally waited for her hero. Django and his wife embraced each other, but Django didn't leave immediately. He still had unfinished business, his revenge. So, at Calvin's funeral in the evening, Django returned to the estate. As the others waited, Django slowly emerged from the shadows, wearing his master's clothes. He was no longer anyone's slave. He fully controlled his own destiny. Then, he raised his gun and took down 2 of Calvin's henchmen. Next, he instructed 2 maids to bid their mistress farewell. Finally, when it was the butler's turn, the old man surprisingly threw aside his cane, revealing his perfectly healthy legs. It turned out that for all these years, he had been pretending to be crippled, using his false infirmity to gain his master's trust. This self-inflicted slavery was more numbing and pitiful than being forced into servitude. So Django decided to grant him his hypocrisy. Django told the butler that over the years, he must have seen countless slaves, but Django was the one in a million. Amid the butler's curses, Django lit the fuse, then turned and walked away. In the firelight, Django walked out of the estate, with his wife by his side, ready to ride off into the horizon. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.